Welcome to this episode of Against the Mountains of Madness. I'm your host, Jason.
And I'm John C. Wright.
And on this episode, we're going to be talking about It Ain't Gonna Happen science fiction. So, John, what the heck is that?
About in the year 2000, there was a science fiction writer who had too much time on his hands, and instead of writing a science fiction book, he wrote a manifesto called the Mundane Science Fiction Movement. I will not embarrass the gentleman by repeating his name. But his manifesto said that science fiction was too escapist, he says. And they thought that setting the stories in the world closer to our own would give the narrative more political and social power. Okay? So he wanted to tell stories only about the near future and only about things below Earth's atmosphere. And so in his manifesto, he said that he wanted to make sure that there were no intelligent computers or rocket battles or things like that. Things that are scientifically implausible.
That sounds really boring.
Yes, it does. And
I mean,
and
like
I
that just sounds like sort of modern techno, like science fiction is then limited to sort of modern techno thriller.
I think he would like. I think the mundanes would like stories about people worrying about global warming or something like that. You know.
Okay, but just aren't we just going to fix the hole in the ozone layer by putting a giant toupee on it?
Yes, but unfortunately, the mad scientist that we hired has gone insane and is locked up in in a dream machine, and we're going to have to send in a team to the Earth's core to get him back. And there's an unknown civilization down there with a beautiful space princess who needs to be, Earth princess who needs to be rescued. So,
fortunately, we have a large supply of unobtainium to build the machine.
Yes, to drill down to yes, and with when we can get there at warp speed. And if we make a mistake, we'll just go back to the TARDIS and go back 7 days. And we have the broken TARDIS repaired yet, do we not? In any case, you see my point. Mundane science fiction just sounds boring to me because the guy was trying to make it socially conscious and self-aware.
Ew.
Okay, now, when I heard about this, I decided that on my own, I would start my own movement called the New Space Princess Movement, which was to restore the dignity and the power and the panache of outrageously operatic space opera with beautiful space princesses who are half-clad and all gorgeous and menaced by space dragons and space goblins from Mars and have to be rescued by an Earthman with a torn shirt, a brawny chest, and a flashing sword. Okay, because that's what science fiction is to me, space opera.
That's what science fiction should be.
Well, yes and no. There are some people who also like nuts and bolts science fiction, and I've written one or two nuts and bolts science fiction stories myself. I kind of like the discipline of it. The analog readers should not be sneered at because they like to hear the details of how it actually works, and some of them have a rather disciplined, speculative approach. I like Larry Niven, I like Arthur C. Clarke's approach, and so on and so forth. But a friend of mine named Mr. Curmudgeon had kind of the opposite view from me. But he, for some reason, thought I was in his camp. He thought that the science fiction is basically things that simply weren't going to happen. That are excuse me. He coined the term "ain't gonna happen" science fiction. So here's a summary of his manifesto. It's got 8 or 9 points to it. First, there's going to be no colonization of space. Space will not be colonized either by an O'Neill colony or any other way. For the same reason that no one lives in a submarine at the bottom of the Marianas Trench or in the Arctic Ocean. Okay, it's not economically feasible to live in such harsh conditions. He says we're never going to meet any intelligent extraterrestrial life. It ain't going to happen. He says, or if we do, they will be incomprehensible, so much that even the question of whether they are truly intelligent will be debatable. And he says, no faster than light drive. It's not just a good idea. It's the law. He claims that medicine may shift where the top of the bell curve falls, but human beings are not going to live much past 80 or 90. We're not going to get the immortality drug. Psionics is not going to happen. It's just magic wearing a lab coat. And time travel is less possible and less realistic than fairy, unicorn, sparkly magic. And on that, I have to agree, even though I've written dozens of science fiction stories by now, time travel stories of my own by now. And he also poo-poos the idea of he poo-poos the idea that science is going to usher in a utopia. We've already had the Soviets and the Red Chinese trying to do utopia for about 100 years now, and the body count is astronomical, and they're nowhere close to even getting a working society, much
Well,
less a utopian one.
he gets that much right at least.
Yes, yes. Now, for philosophical reasons, I do agree with some of these things. For philosophical reasons, I don't believe the human mind can be incarnated in a computer. I don't think. Excuse me, belay that. I think you could probably mimic a human mind in a computer, but I don't think you could build one. If that makes sense. I think it's like virtue. I think it's a thing that can be learned, but it can't be taught. Again, but that's for philosophical reasons. If I'm wrong, then I'm wrong, and we'll have children made of iron someday. But my personal manifesto was, I believe in the space princess theory, which is if you look at how many planets there are in the universe, there's got to be some that are run by monarchies, and there's got to be some that are peopled by people recognizably like us, who look, mammalian, Northern European, like Hollywood starlets. And some of those are being menaced by space goblins, and you have to go rescue them with your brawny chest and your torn shirt with your flashing sword. So I don't see what the problem is. Star Wars had a space princess that had to be rescued. Okay? A Princess of Mars has a space princess.
Shirt, though. Who had a torn shirt in Star Wars?
Kirk had his torn shirt just about every episode. Don't you watch Star Trek? Oh, no, you were Next Gen.
In Star Wars. No, it's Star Wars. Who had a torn shirt in Star Wars?
Star Wars, no one. Star Wars doesn't count then.
Well, I mean, it's got a princess that needs rescuing, and it's got laser swords.
Yep. It's got flashing swords. More flashing than normal, in fact. Lightsabers are cool. Cool as all get out.
Oh, yeah. Hey, I agree.
But the mundane idea, oddly enough, is an idea that I heard before in the year like 1900, back when several of the major magazines being published in the Northeast decided not to print stories that had fantastic elements in them. So things like the ghosts in Shakespeare's Hamlet or the witches in Shakespeare's Macbeth would not show up in these stories. They wanted to write about socially relevant things, like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle or something like that.
So boring.
And they became boring, and so the imagination went underground and popped up at the least expected place imaginable, which is in the pulp magazines. So the early pulps did not distinguish between science fiction and fantasy. They just wrote adventure stories, and sometimes they had spaceships in them, and sometimes they took place in Atlantis, in prehistoric Atlantis, and whatever. They were wild and woolly, and that's my own preference. My own approach and preference is for the romanticism of the fiction. You see. Now, I do have to rush to add one thing. If you want to write a story about a space princess, but you want to make it more based on real modern science, you might have to make her a space senator's daughter, but those are just less romantic and less interesting than space princesses. I'm sorry. You see. If you want to have a republic in space, like the Republic of Mars on the TV show The Expanse, that guy writes my hat's off to him. That guy writes a realistic, hardcore type of science fiction story where, to the delight of my heart, I actually saw a spaceship flying backwards with its torch on to decelerate toward its target. You see? Now, I like Star Trek as much as anyone. I'm a big fan of Mr. Spock and the other unimportant people around him. But the ships there are always oriented up and down, space up and space down. And they even made a note of it in one of the movies. They said that Khan only thinks in two dimensions and space is three-dimensional. So let's sneak up on him from beneath, as if Khan's radar would not work beneath. But they were in a nebula, and radars don't work in nebulas, because something. Even though in real life a nebula is a cloud of particles that's you couldn't even tell you were inside one unless you measured it with a special instrument. But never mind that. They're brightly colored in the movies. See, my point for the whole thing is, I want to read about space princesses as just as much as I want to read about The Expanse, about because part of me likes to hear the nuts and bolts of how the future technology might work. Why not? It's an interesting topic. But if you're going to write a deep science fiction story, oddly enough, you're going to have to get into fairy tale and fantasy territory, because rescuing a princess is something that every man really wants to do, And seeing a farm boy turn into a space wizard is like Harry Potter in space. I mean, Luke Skywalker and Harry Potter, both orphans, right? They both carry a sparkly thing in their hand, and they both face a Dark Lord. Do you see where I'm going with this? The things that make a story fundamentally good are you have one of two theories. You can have Joseph Campbell's theory of the eternal hero's journey. That's if you're serious. Then, if you're me, I say the important things you have to have is busty space princesses, sparkly somethings or others, either laser swords or magic wands, and then a Dark Lord to defeat. You know, those are the elements you need, and maybe a lovable rogue or a comedy relief robot or something. You know, make it fun.
Who's the busty princess in Harry Potter? Dare I ask? Hermione, I suppose.
Harry Potter. Well, she wasn't busty at first, but the actress turned into something rather easy on the eyes as time went on. But I don't think they had a princess in that story, so it's inferior. I don't think there was a princess needing rescuing in Lord of the Rings either, and that's the seminal novel for high fantasy. There were princesses. Aragorn marries Arwen at the end, but she was not being menaced by goblins or anything. Frodo was menaced by goblins, and he was vertically challenged. He was a short little man, and he did have a sparkly thing in his hand. It was a magic ring, you know.
It's true.
So the mundane people. Here's what's going on with the mundane people. I don't know this guy, and I don't know what was behind the mundane space movement. But he was a socialist, I assume, from the way he talked, because only socialists talk about getting more political power through telling stories, because they're all about power. Now, my friend the curmudgeon, the ain't gonna happen science fiction guy, he was religious, and he looks down on science fiction a little bit because he thinks it's kind of escapism also, but people trying to get some of the flavor of the actual magical and miraculous world in which we really live, you see, because we Catholics believe there's an entire elaborate machinery of the unseen world, an unseen order that's behind the seen order, and that we're in the grips of a spiritual warfare that's invisible to mortal men. Yeah. Okay, we live in the most dramatic possible, and if you make the wrong decisions in life, and you don't believe in the king who was secretly buried under a magical star and born in a manger, and then got resurrected by a fifth level resurrection spell or whatever. I'm sorry, we believe in things that are supernatural. Okay,
of course.
So to us, the supernatural is second nature. It seems normal to us almost, as much as it can be. And so I think our attitude towards science fiction and fantasy is slightly different. In fantasy in particular, I noticed that some of the most famous fantasy stories are written by J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, both people famed for their Christian faith, their deep Christian faith. When science fiction and fantasy is written by guys who are a little more radical, like Michael Moorcock, you get something like Elric's Eternal Champion, where your characters are memorable, but they're kind of dark and dreary, and he carries a magic sword that's eventually going to kill his best friend and maybe kill him too. And it's not really as deep. It's shallower. It's a fine adventure story, but it's shallow and it's full of no offense to Michael Moorcock, I'm a fan, but his story is full of kind of teenage angst posturing. At least the ones I read in the '60s. He may have changed since then. I don't keep up with his more recent oeuvre. But the guys who want to make things mundane, I think there's two kinds. There's the kind that think we should turn our attention to real divine things. I can't really mock them, but I do. And there's the guy, and there's the guys who want us to concentrate on solving problems on Earth. When I was young, that was the thing. That was the reason why people protested against the space program. They thought we shouldn't spend money on sending rockets to the moon. And I was like, "Are you kidding? That was like the greatest event mankind ever did. After the Wright brothers, my ancestors, taught us how to fly. I mean, come on, it's Greetings, world. This is John C. Wright. I and my compatriot, Jason Rennie, take up arms weekly against the mountains of madness that are afflicting and overwhelming the modern age. You are welcome here among like-minded souls, and I hope we have provided a work of insight, hope, or humor, and perhaps an explanation of the insanity that is the modern age. For more content and conversation on these and other fascinating topics of philosophy, science fiction, and current events, please visit our Substack at atmom.substack.com. Tips, bribes, and generous patronage are warmly encouraged. Thank you.
So, yeah, I agree with you. Like, science fiction, for all of its pretense to being scientific, even something goofy like Star Trek, which is sort of... it's got a veneer of... It wants to have a veneer of scientific plausibility, but it doesn't. Yeah. It doesn't take it too seriously. Even to the point that they have in every episode when they're solving problems, it's a speech of technobabble explained by some simple real world analogy, which they took off in Futurama.
Well, usually on the show, someone would come up with a complicated plan, then explain it with a simple analogy.
If we can reroute engine power through the primary weapons and reconfigure them to Melvar's frequency, that should overload his electroquantum structure.
Like putting too much air in a balloon.
Of course! It's so simple!
And then I was watching rewatching Next Gen through just for fun, and Geordie did that, and I just fell off my chair laughing. And I mean, they do it all the time, but it was just like I'd been primed to look for it, and then they did it. It's just like, but they did it, like exactly like that. It wasn't like the Futurama one basically wasn't exaggerated in the slightest. Like it was exactly the same level of silliness. But anyway,
well, there's a difference, in my opinion, between hard SF and soft SF.
Sure.
Between technical men with screwdrivers science fiction and adventure science fiction. I'm more partial to adventure science fiction. But I have written my fair share of screwdriver science fiction. In fact, in the Golden Age, in my first book, I did not postulate anything that could not be, at least theoretically made, given our modern understanding of science. I said there was no faster than light drive, for example, and I tried to postulate how you could colonize the stars without such a thing, and it would require a medical technology that would allow you to live for the thousands of years you would need to cross the distance, and so on and so forth. One of my speculations was actually called out as being unrealistic, which was a speculation I got from a scientist, which says that the scientist speculated that the transuranic elements are unstable, but he thought that there was a possibility that there would be a stable island of larger molecules that would not evaporate within a microsecond like the transuranics do. And I said, okay, one of those is going to be a super strong, super tough, super durable ally called unobtainium, or called chrysobantium, I forget what I called it, that I was going to make out of my spaceship hull, because you need a spaceship hull of unobtainium if you're going to run into a particle at 99% of the speed of light and not be destroyed.
Yeah.
There's a lot of technical problems with getting to the stars, and if you were going to ask me honestly, I would say it ain't going to happen unless Einstein's wrong, which he could be, because even when scientists are wrong, they're a new model of the universe might find a loophole that Einstein doesn't allow for,
Well,
but
there are many ways to skin a cat. Certainly, I always liked that Babylon 5 doesn't have faster than light travel. You can travel faster than light, but you travel faster than light by you travel out of the universe into subspace, which is effectively smaller.
It's hyperdrive.
Travel through that. Well, it's not hyper, but it's not traveling.
They go into hyperspace and they come out again. They go into another three-dimensional space and they come out again.
But you don't travel faster than the speed of light through normal space.
Well, it depends on your definition. If you leave point A and you get to point B faster than a light wave could have gone there, then you are traveling faster than the light.
Maybe, I suppose. Well, the light could travel the same path you did, and it would arrive at the
No,
same
I mean, if you get to Alpha Centauri in less than 4 years, and you come back, and your girlfriend is still your age on Earth, then you've defeated Einstein. You've done something he says can't happen. You say, and you've done it by saying that the distance between the 2 points is not what it seems to be. The distance in hyperspace is actually much closer. It's actually only a few hundred yards away, or whatever.
Well, yeah. So, but I mean, but you don't actually travel faster than 300,000 kilometers a second, or whatever the speed of light is. 186,000 miles a second. C.
I just call it C for short.
Sure, but you don't actually travel faster than that at any point.
No, correct.
Which is what I mean by you don't travel faster than light.
Right.
So,
but you actually do. You just
sort of. I mean, I guess
you get to Alpha Centauri and you come back and your girlfriend's still young. So
sure,
she hasn't aged. She hasn't aged 8 years. So it's
okay,
fine.
Sure,
you're good.
But in that sense, you've traveled faster than light could traverse the distance through normal space.
Well, you're
sure.
You're still defeating Einstein, because Einstein postulated that there was no simultaneity throughout the universe. That the frame of reference of our star and the frame of reference of Alpha Centauri were different frames of reference. So that if you did manage to get there and back again in what you seem to be a short time, in order for the universe to fit the laws of nature as we understand them, time would have to go by on Earth at least equal to 8 years. You say, and the hyperspace defeats that because the hyperspace postulates that there's a fourth dimension we can move into with a ship and not be destroyed somehow. Now, that's fine, but it's magic. It's not. That's not. We have absolutely zero evidence scientifically that sort of thing is even theoretically possible. You know, there are people who postulate that there might be 11 dimensions based on supersymmetry breaking and stuff like that, but we don't at the moment even have a balloon that can go even an inch into the fourth dimension, much less go in, safely transit, and come out again. So it's
what can I say? Well, all right. What can I say? In 1890, they said heavier than air flight was impossible.
Sure, but the fundamental scientific model didn't say that. They just said it was impractical. And the New York Times said that you could never get a rocket outside Earth's atmosphere because there's no air for the rocket blast to push against. That's because the New York Times people don't understand high school level physics. They don't understand Newton's laws of motion, you say. But my objection is not based on me not understanding Einstein's relativity. My objection is based on the fact that we don't have any evidence whatsoever that the model is incorrect. Furthermore, when Einstein clarified... Let me finish my sentence, please. When Einstein clarified Newton, apples didn't start falling upward. Newton's laws still work under the conditions that Newtonian observation takes place, at lower than light speed, near Earth's surface, and so on and so forth. So even when there's a scientific revolution, the previous possibility, what was previously impossible, doesn't suddenly become possible. You see, so Einstein would have to be fundamentally deeply wrong, not just a little bit wrong, not just wrong around the edges like Newton was, okay, but as different as Ptolemy was to Copernicus, okay. The thing we think of as time-space would have to be organized differently for us to get fast and light drive.
Fair enough, but we know Einstein's wrong.
I think he's relatively wrong.
Well, okay, but I mean, quantum mechanics works. Quantum mechanics works and special relativity works, but they can't reconcile the two.
Right. We know our model is not the total theory of everything.
The model is wrong. Like the model is wrong. We know that, but I mean that's okay.
My study.
Anyway, we're getting off topic.
Of the history of science. No, it's still on topic because the topic is what science fiction allows as possible and not possible. I list Fast and Light Drive in the unicorn category, but more than half my stories have Fast and Light Drive in them. Okay, because it's an accepted trope of the genre, and because science does change over time. People could have a different theory of how the universe works in times to come. We might discover something fundamentally wrong with our model, and it might be possible. Okay. Magic is a different question. I once went to let me tell you a real quick story that's kind of not on topic. I once went to a movie with my three friends. We went to go see a medical drama, a military picture, a historical picture, a war picture, and Willow that had Willow was like a fantasy version of Star Wars made by the same guy. Mm-hmm. Now, one of my friends was a nurse practitioner, was a doctor, and he just laughed at the things they were doing in the medical drama, and he said it was completely unrealistic. And of course, he kind of spoiled it for me. And my military historian friend, when he saw Braveheart, and said that's not the way that battle went. There was a bridge involved. The knights were in armor. They weren't painted blue in those days. And he just went on and on and on, and he just ruined Braveheart for me. Then my friend William the Witch, who was a practicing occultist, saw that at the end of the movie Willow, where the main character Willow does a sleight of hand trick to fool the evil witch who's trying to send the magical baby into the magical afterlife, so that because otherwise the baby's going to kill her, stumbles up against the altar and gets destroyed by the very spell she was preparing to destroy the baby. And my magician friend said that couldn't work. He was clearly using the baby's blood to identify it to the spirits, and they would not have mistaken her for that. Which I said, wait a minute, what? He was like an analog reader for magic. He was like a hardcore magic guy, and he didn't like magic in stories being used not according to the traditional rites and rituals of occultism or what have you. And I was like, dude, okay, But let me end the story by saying I had my revenge. We went to go see a Perry Mason movie, and I, as a lawyer, pointed out every single thing they did that could not actually happen in a real court of law. So the point of my story is there are some people who aren't willing to suspend their suspension of disbelief because they have really fixed ideas about what's possible and what's not.
Well,
but science fiction and fantasy is the genre of the impossible, the genre of what might be possible, but we're not sure is possible. It's in the twilight zone, halfway between here and reality, halfway between here and the future.
Well, yes, so. I was going to say there's a whole genre of YouTube videos of people picking apart various scenes from shows. There's one I love by he's a fiery paramedic, and he green screen. Well, he does lots of these things happen to me on the things I've actually seen as a paramedic. But one of the things he does that I enjoy are he green screens himself into medical type TV shows with paramedics on the side of the road treating people. And I've watched a number of these shows, and I kind of enjoy them. But he's going, yes, thank you, miss. You're going to die now when they do this to you. That's totally wrong. It
was like my medical friend. My medical friend says when you're trying to pump someone's heart and do mathematical resuscitation, they will continue to do that for an hour. They're not going to give up on that guy. And I said, this is only an hour show. The movie's only 90 minutes. They can't show an hour of medical technology measures, medical extreme measures, resuscitation measures.
Being said,
but he said, look, they go like this. There's no heartbeat. He's dead. He says, no, that's not a medical thing, and that's not the way you do it. I said, fine. Then I pushed him up against an altar and had the demons carry him away because he had the baby's blood on him. So.
Well, I mean, that being said, like, the reality is CPR, which always seems to work to revive people in TV, doesn't really work very well at all. It works like 3 or 4% of the time.
Depends on whether it's the hero or not.
But it works. It's like it's a crap. It's better than nothing, but it's literally better than nothing. It doesn't really work very well, unfortunately. But
no.
Anyway.
But if you want realism, read a newspaper. That's my story.
Well, that's true.
The ironic thing about the argument between the Mundanes and the Space Princess people is the Mundanes said certain things are simply not going to happen in the future. The Mundanes thought that we were never going to have intelligent robots. Now, I'm going to put intelligent robots in my stories anyway because they're supposed to be... They're symbolic. They're like the Tin Woodman of Oz. They're no more realistic than the Tin Woodman of Oz. Just by the way, I myself don't happen to believe it's possible. I don't think you can put a soul into a metal container. Okay.
Do you have to have a soul to be intelligent?
I believe so. Yes. Yes. I believe that for philosophical reasons. But hey, I could be wrong. I mean, tomorrow the AI could learn how to draw a hand with 4 fingers on it, and then could then make itself self-aware by its own efforts somehow, and then wake up. I've written stories about computers that were struck by lightning and found God. So I'm not going to say what's impossible in a universe that's being ruled by an intelligence greater than mine, which is the universe I believe I live in. Now, most science fiction stories take place in a universe that's much more mechanistic and doesn't have much room for magic, but it makes room for psionics. Okay. I mean, Spock can read minds. Deanna Troi can read minds. Deanna Troi is that the right name?
Deanna Troi. Well, she can
read emotions. Her mom.
She can read emotions. I mean, reading emotions is reading a mind, sort of.
Yeah, it's reading part of the mind. Sure. And Doctor Who can speak all languages because of the gifts of the Time Lords.
Well, that's
what I'm saying.
The TARDIS does that for them. The TARDIS does that for them. They cover that.
Oh, be all nitpicky with me. Okay, fine. What I'm saying is, the nitpicky guys do get a certain pleasure out of seeing movies like The Martian or Interstellar, which really take the time and trouble to be scientifically accurate. I myself get pleasure out of such shows. I like it when they're scientifically accurate. I wish I was less nitpicky, but I actually get annoyed when I'm watching a cartoon or something, and they mistake the words solar system and galaxy. You see? The idea that the Skrull are from a different galaxy, from the Andromeda Galaxy, when there's plenty of stars a lot closer that are a lot easier to get with. One thing I liked about Star Blazers, the space battleship Yamamoto, is they had the distance between here and the Greater Magellanic Cloud correct. And they actually gave a number value for how their tachyon drive worked and how fast it would take them to get there. And they had a countdown at the end of every show because the Earth was going to be destroyed if they didn't get the Cosmo DNA to reverse the nuclear poisoning. Okay.
Yeah,
Now,
sure.
that was a space opera of the first water because they didn't even bother hiding the fact that it was an aircraft carrier, not an aircraft carrier, but they had a battleship. It was a battleship equipped with a star drive, and it just looked like a ship in space with an up and a down. And it had aircraft in a place where there's no air, and it was great, okay?
Yeah.
Nobody can mock that show. It was wonderful. Except for the robot was a little obscurity for me, but never mind that. That's the Japanese. And they redid it, and they actually did a pretty good job, too. They redid it. Now, are my analog friends, my hard set friends, going to say, well, you couldn't actually put a fast and light drive in the hulk of an old World War II battleship and send it into space? And I would go, guys, are you going to enjoy the show or are you going to not enjoy the show? You say. Now,
why couldn't you do that?
What's that?
Why couldn't you do that? I mean,
that's the problem. It's not a thing I think I can criticize someone for, because when someone says galaxy and they mean solar system, that actually annoys me and it takes me out of the story. It makes it so that I don't. It makes it so that I don't. Let me give you an example. In the thriller Greenland, which was a story about a comet disaster and guys trying to get to shelter, and it was very exciting and very well done, top-notch movie. The radio announcer in the background said the comet came from another solar system, and I said, "You guys don't know what comets are, do you? Comets come from the Oort cloud. A body from another solar system wouldn't necessarily be a comet. How would it get here? I mean, is it a rogue planet like the planet Mongo at the beginning of Flash Gordon or something? You see what I'm saying? It's little things like that get my goat, and I wish they did not, because I would much rather simply enjoy the story. Let me give you another example, if you don't mind me saying so. I love Star Wars. I don't think Star Wars is scientifically accurate. I don't think it's meant to be scientifically accurate. No. Whether you consider it to be science fiction or not is a matter of your personal definition. I consider it to be science fiction because it takes place in a science fiction flavored background. I have a very broad definition of science fiction.
No, I do.
Rocket ships and laser swords, science fiction.
Fiction.
Okay. Elves and unicorns, fantasy. Okay. Elves in space, Vulcans. You see how it goes? Sorry, elves with magic powers in space. If they can.
Unicorns are real. What do you think a narwhal is?
Yes, unicorns are real. Thank you very much. In any case, they have one horn. Well, actually, they're unidental, aren't they? Isn't that a tooth?
It is apparently a tooth.
Okay.
Apparently, the legend of they suspect the legend of the unicorn came from people finding the narwhal tooth washed up, and this is the speculation, and so they looked at the size of the thing and what size animal would have this, about the size of a horse with a horn. It's plausible, and a narwhal's are roughly that sort of size. I mean, it's actually not that far off. So
I've heard two other theories about the origin of the unicorn story. One is that one of the tribes of Israel had a ruminant animal, a deer, for its heraldic beast, but they drew it with one horn because they drew it in profile, and so in all the religious iconography they had a one-horned beast as their critter, and when King James translated the one-horned beast into English, they used the word unicorn rather than whatever it was, whatever type of animal it was. I don't remember off the top of my head. The other was that it was based on a Herodotus or someone like him's description of the rhino, of the rhinoceros.
Well, they are battle unicorns.
What's that?
They are battle unicorns.
Yep. But in any case, unicorn, fantasy, rocket, science. Now, honestly, the Star Wars, which is one of my favorite movies, you don't make bank turns in space. You couldn't hear engines in space. You wouldn't see lasers in space. There's just a lot of things in space that are just not going to happen, okay? But, what can I say? I'm also a fan of the cartoon Space Ghost from 1968, where the Space Ghost routinely pops the canopy of his Phantom Cruiser and zooms off on his rocket belt to go, because he's faster by himself than in his machine, and then he uses Inviso power to turn invisible. And so, okay, that's fine. He doesn't go blind when he does that, for some reason. You see? The problem is hard SF it does scratch an itch that people have, at least science fiction readers and writers have, for trying to get kind of a realistic, I want to hear a story about how a rocket would actually get to Mars. It should be feasible. We should be able to land a probe on the moon without having it stumble and fall over, which is what happened earlier this year. Okay, so we make up a story about it. That's fine. I like techno thrillers too, if they get the details correct. I even like fantasy stories about people written by Lyric Correa shooting vampires and werewolves if he gets his gun technology correct, okay? Because he gets the details right. Now, I also want to see if you do the imaginative thing and simply make up elves and dwarves and dragons and put them in Tolkien's Middle-earth, and you get those details correct also, and you're consistent within your own dream. That I really like, you see.
Well, that's
again,
important, isn't it?
You want to have verisimilitude, but I think it's important, but it's not necessary. Here's what I mean by that. Harry Potter was not self-consistent with its own magic system. Okay? If you had been running it as a D&D game and you gave one of the players the polyjuice potion or the ability to tell whether or not the truth serum, they would do things with it you would logically do with those things, and the society around them would develop defenses against those things, ways to check against those things. That because otherwise you couldn't run a society where people can change shape and detect lies. You couldn't have commercial advertisements or politicians if people could always check to see whether you were lying, and so on and so forth. Pardon me for being cynical, but I don't think anyone who was a Harry Potter fan was actually taken out of the story because the Time Turner gets destroyed because she realized she couldn't actually, because it solves too many problems that way. It's a lighthearted story meant to have it as one of the tongue-in-cheek side jokes. Is the schoolgirl wants to be able to attend classes that are scheduled opposite each other. That's what the Time Turner is for. If you're going to get all time cop on me and get into Doctor Who and TARDIS and Time Tunnel and Robert Heinlein by his bootstraps level of paradox salvation, no, it's a kid's book. You got to be in the right mindset for it.
It's true.
Now, that said, I still got a thrill. I still laughed out loud when I saw The Expanse and I saw the spaceship flying backwards with its torch lit. And when they went through a hail of debris, it was like being hammered by a hail of machine gun fire. It wasn't like on Babylon 5, where the Viper shoots the Cylon and he flies through the
Battlestar Galactica.
The Galactica, I'm sorry, Battlestar Galactica, and he flies through the smoke and flame of the rubbish, of the wreckage,
But that looks cool.
Oh, sure, it looks cool. So do Bank Turns in Space. The Star Wars was based on World War I dogfight.
Yeah.
Okay, and it's supposed to. When Top Gun does a modern dogfight, it's at such high speeds and at such long distances that it's visually hard to make look impressive. Though the movie did a good job of it. The movie did it. But to have your TIE fighter swinging right behind you, in your six, so that your friendly robot beeps and trills excitedly. I mean, come on, that's top-notch cinema. That's great.
That's true.
Now, oddly enough, when you know me, I think Star Wars is a fairy tale. It starts with Once Upon a Time. It actually literally starts with Once Upon a Time in the opening credits in a galaxy far, far away. Okay, because that's hearkening back to the black and white cliffhanger serials of Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers that the filmmaker saw when he was a child. It's hearkening back to our childhood. That's why there was a screen crawl at the beginning. Fine. When, in the prequels, he tried to make it a little more scientific by introducing the midichlorians in the bloodstream to explain why... midichlorians in the bloodstream to explain why you have mystical powers generated by the spiritual forces of all the Taoist psychic energy of the galaxy. Everyone I know just groaned at that. It didn't make the story any more enjoyable. It made it less because it broke the genre. It was no longer a fairy tale. Now, it was trying to be science fiction-y. But if you're going to be science fiction-y about it, if you're going to have a body in your bloodstream that produces Jedi power, then you're going to capture Jedi and stick them in the Jedi juicer, exude their blood, put it in a centrifuge, and then inject yourself with it to give yourself psychic powers. I believe Dr. Bones McCoy does a similar thing on the Plato's Stepchildren episode of First Generation Star Trek, where he injects everyone with a certain drug that gives them mental powers. Psychic powers.
Wasn't that what they were trying to do in The Mandalorian to Grogu, to Baby Yoda?
Yes,
I mean,
think so.
not literally juice him, but something along those lines seemed to be the story.
Something sinister.
I don't know. I watched the first 2 seasons, and then I just heard season 3 was awful, so I haven't watched it yet.
I did the same thing. I watched the first 2 seasons. I heard the 3rd season was awful, and I didn't watch it. I mean, after seeing Luke Skywalker show up and battle evil death robots with his glowing sword, I was satisfied.
Yeah, me too. Like, that'll do.
That'll do.
Mind you, isn't the point of storytelling really, certainly for science fiction and fantasy, isn't the point to tell a story that's supposed to give you something to look up to? Like, here's a hero to aspire to emulate, be that an ancient hero or a future hero. It's the hero battling the big bad evil, be that a dragon or a Sith Lord or the Emperor throwing lightning from his fingers or whatever, and defeating them. Isn't the point of a lot of this sort of storytelling to show that not so much that monsters exist, but that they can be defeated? To quote Chesterton, I think, to butcher Chesterton.
Chesterton said the point of fairy tales is not to tell children that monsters exist. They know monsters exist. The point is to show them that St. George can defeat the dragon. Yeah.
But like, isn't
that is one of the many points of storytelling. Storytelling is as complex as human life is.
Well,
so I would say that. Let me put it this way: everything that a good story has in it, plot, character, theme, action, setting, science fiction and fantasy also have to be a good story. You have to have interesting characters, the interesting plot. But science fiction and fantasy have one other element mundane stories don't have, and that is world building. You have to make up a world that's different from ours. Your story doesn't need to be set there. You could have someone come from that world to ours and be a character or a prop that just comes from another world, you see. But for science fiction, it's going to be futuristic and extraterrestrial, and for fairy tales and fantasy, it's going to be unearthly. Okay? So, basically, science fiction is, if you get a visitor from Mars, if you get a man from Mars, that's science fiction. If you get an elf from Elfland, that's fantasy. Or you go there yourself. You go into the Wood Perilous and you meet the bizarre creatures or the 4-armed Martians or what have you. So you still need everything you have in an ordinary story. Now, a story like Brave New World of 1984 is not about heroism. It's a warning story. It's a story to warn you what will happen if you don't
that's true.
Gird up your loins. Okay? But adventure stories are about the adventure. They are about the hero's journey. They are about man being pitted against the cosmos. And in both science fiction and fantasy, a major part of the cosmos is that you're dealing with the unknown. Okay? In a detective story, detective stories are actually about justice. They're actually about trying to find the the murderer and expose him and send him to justice. And war stories like even a cartoon like G.I. Joe is about loyalty. It's about showing that if the team works together, you can defeat the enemy that doesn't work together. Okay, that's why G.I. Joe has no one in the same uniform. It's also to sell toys. But it's actually about something noble, even if it's pitched at children. It's actually about something. It's actually about loyalty. Romances are, of course, about
aspirational.
It's
Aspirational.
aspirational.
Is maybe the word I wanted.
It's aspirational, right?
All of these things are aspirational in one way or another.
John W. Campbell Jr. science fiction, analog science fiction, is about better living through technology. It was about the idea that the universe is unknown but is knowable, and that a rational man armed with a screwdriver and a slipstick can figure it out and solve the problems through the use of reason. You see, it was very optimistic and very can-do, very very much in the spirit of Yankee can-do spirit. That's why it flourished more in North America, more in America than in England and in France. Though they have science fiction too. But I noticed that when English science fiction was at its height, with H.G. Wells, for example, a lot of his stories are actually rather grim. The Time Machine is a story about the desolate future that awaits us. The Island of Dr. Moreau is about a guy finding out that humans are just beasts, and so on and so forth. The Invisible Man was a story about a guy who wanted to be a tyrant. They're kind of warning stories, They're not. So
they're bleaker.
They're bleaker, but that might have just been Wells. He was a socialist, so what can I say? Doctor Who was not bleak. Doctor Who was actually rather charming. Before it went mad. Star Trek was also charming before it went mad. Star Wars
Yeah.
was my favorite genre before it went mad. And it went mad always in the same way. It went mad because the political opinions of the people who got control of it were at odds with the fundamental imaginative effort of what science fiction was about. You see, they were in line with the mundanes, to bring it back to the beginning. The mundanes want to write about this world, here and now problems, which they want to solve through socialism. They want to solve through totalitarian government. If they want to have power so they can create a utopia. Or they just hate us and they want to have power so they can destroy us. You take your pick. I'm not a mind reader. It's one of those two things. Okay? So who wants to curtail the imagination and only write mundane science fiction? Well, my curmudgeon friend thinks our priorities are wrong. He thinks that we should use our imagination to imagine the spirit world and put our fantastic aspirations there. I respectfully disagree. I think that Dante's Inferno is a perfectly valid way of using the imagination to talk about divine things, even though it was as scientifically accurate as the science of the time could be, because the science of the time was astrology, And but he had all his dates and dimensions correct for the size of the Earth, traveling through the center of the Earth, and so on and so forth. Dante was scientifically accurate. Narnia, I know people who were converted to Christianity from that fairy tale. Okay? I have no sympathy for people who say, well, there's magicians in Narnia, and therefore that's unchristian. I go, I'm sorry. For one thing, no, there's not. There's witches who are evil, and then there's supernatural beings who have magical powers, like a magical lion or a magical star that's on Earth. Okay? But there's no one who studies grimoires and is a good guy. Maybe there's a dwarf who reads the stars, but that's not the same thing. The wise men did the magi in the Bible do the same thing, so you can't criticize them there. And again, similar thing for in Lord of the Rings. In Lord of the Rings, the elves have some magic, but it's not the enemy's magic. It's not used for deception. It's used for insight. And the magician, Gandalf the Wizard, is a wise man. He's like Merlin the magician, And he's also not a human being. Just by the way, just spoilers. He comes back from the dead. He's not what he seems to be. You see. So, both in fantasy and in science fiction, here's let me see if I can draw this to a point. The people who want mundane fantasy and mundane science fiction, they just don't like us. They just don't like to use the imagination. They want us to concentrate on their particular worldview, which is surface level and unimaginative. Socialists are just not that. They don't like people to be free. They don't like people to be free with the imagination. The free thinkers are the least free thinking people I know. Okay.
Yeah.
When you finding a good fairy tale or a good fantasy story is like finding an oasis in a bitter desert. For a moment, you're reminded that this material world is not the real world. It's not our home. Our home is in heaven. And good fantasy stories, even something like Conan the Barbarian, which is really not Christian in mood or flavor or anything, okay, tells you there's more to life than what you see. There's something deeper out there. Now, in Conan, it's usually something deeper and darker and Lovecraftian, because Robert E. Howard was friends with Lovecraft, and they borrowed some of the same demon gods for their heroes. In Lovecraft's case, to see and go mad. In Conan's case, to see and hack to pieces. They had a different approach to the supernatural. But there's something spooky and supernatural. They're like ghost stories. A ghost story, no matter how well or poorly it's done, always tells you there's more to life than what you see. A science fiction story says things are not going to be tomorrow the way they are now. They could be better, like Star Trek. They could be worse, like 1984. Okay? But don't just rest on your laurels. Don't just assume that everything's going to be the way it is, the way it's always going to be. You see? And that's a tonic. That makes people think about the future and maybe start planning for it. You see? Now, it can backfire. When 1984 was written, I thought people would take it as a warning message not to let England and America turn into that. But some people took it as a instruction manual. Yes, exactly.
Oh, it's horrifying,
Exactly.
isn't it?
Yep.
Yeah. Brave New World in 1984 were not ideas to be...
Yep.
I saw a meme the other day of Mr. Bean stealing off the guy... as the picture of Mr. Bean looking at the guy next to him, copying off his notes, and then like, whoop, no, I wasn't looking. And it was just captioned... every dystopian science fiction novel and government. And government was copying off them. It's like, yeah, I wish that wasn't the case.
Well, if you want a John Wright 1 second definition of science fiction is actually stories about the here and now, but we tell the story from years apart and far away. sometimes from other planets, from other epochs, looking, from the future looking backward. There was actually an early science fiction story called Looking Backward, written by a guy named Bellamy. Or from the point of view of an alien or the point of view of a robot, seeing what humanity is. To know what humanity is, you have to step outside and look at it objectively. See? Now, no mundane story, not even a historical drama, can look at mankind from the outside, because you could introduce a character who was insane and thought he wasn't human, but if you're telling a story set in the here and now, that can't be, you see. Yeah. But if you give me the freedom to talk about Martians, I could say, well, the Martians have no sex. They reproduce by a different method, and so they don't understand human sexuality, for example. And then you can write Stranger in a Strange Bed or something, not its real name. You could write a story about that. You could use it for a story, you see. Yep. And you could say something about human nature. Now, if you're Robert Heinlein, you're going to say the wrong thing about human nature, how sex is fun and we should all have an orgy, But nonetheless, you're still leading with people to speculate about what human beings look like from the outside. The mundanes don't want to step outside. They don't want to step outside their little mental prison, their thought prison. Because in the old days, I think you could be a utopian. In the 1930s, I think it was still possible for an honest man to believe the Soviet system might produce wealth, peace, and prosperity. Nowadays, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, no sane man believes that. No. It's very clear that the wokesters, who are cultural Marxists, they're Marxists, but they just have they're not economic Marxists. They concentrate on things like race and sex.
Yeah, they've moved the goalposts. They had to.
They're not even trying to create a utopia. They say they're trying to create a sustainable environment where you don't use resources. Like life in a monastery, I guess, is the goal, where you live in a pod and eat bugs, okay? Now, if you write science fiction, then you have developed the habit of thinking about what the ramifications of your hypothesis are. That's what science fiction writers do. A science fiction writer is different from a fantasy writer, because if you have pigs fly, like in a fairy story, then the science fiction writer goes, you have to put a roof over your pig pen to prevent your pigs from flying away. You have to clip their wings before you let them out to root around for acorns. You have to carry an umbrella to make sure the pig poop doesn't fall on your head. You think of what the ramifications are. Okay? Now, you don't want people thinking about the ramifications when people say, oh yes, what we're going to do is curtail the population. Because the science fiction writer is going to go, wait a minute, well, how are you going to do that exactly? I mean, read Larry Niven. They had mother lotteries in his overpopulated future world. Watch the movie Soylent Green. There's some science fiction writers who thought about what would happen if you tried to control the population numbers. Or, in the case of Soylent Green, if you didn't try to control the population numbers, and so on and so forth. You see? So the mundanes have to prevent us from thinking about these things. They have to prevent us from thinking about the future. By the way, not by keeping the future blank, they have to present it like, I believe of all things, Red Cortez, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the American senator, made a little cartoon. What's that?
Occasional Cortex?
Our other name for her, yes. Made a little cartoon about the future, of how livable it was, because we all had light rail trains moving everywhere, run on renewable green energy, and everything was windmill powered. All of our airplanes were windmill powered, and we had gotten rid of nuclear energy. We had abolished the oil industry, and all the oil workers were now working as Peace Corps volunteers, helping babies in the third world or something. It was the most ill thought out dystopia I've ever seen or could imagine. She should have gone to science fiction writing 101. It was terrible. Okay, because it was actually nightmare. It was actually a nightmare what she was describing, but she didn't realize it. See. Yeah. So they can present kind of an image. The mundanes can present kind of a glassy image, a glassy-eyed image for what might be happening in the next 20 years. But they can't go out 100 years. They can't go out 400 years. No. And they can't say what is the nature of mankind in relation to eternity and infinity, which H.G. Wells did do. H.G. Wells in his Time Traveler talked about what man's relationship to eternity was. And it was a dismal picture because he didn't believe in God. We were just a speck in the universe. Yeah. And in his short story, The Star, he talks about how small man is compared to the universe, Now, so did, by the way, C.S. Lewis in his Narnia books and in his Space Trilogy, which is one of the best science fiction books I've ever read. If you haven't read That Hideous Strength, I recommend you read it. Although it is labeled as a fairy tale for grown-ups, it is actually science fiction. You see?
Yes, highly recommend
Because
the Space Trilogy.
he predicts the future more accurately even than George Orwell does. You see?
Oh yeah, no, he nailed it, didn't he?
Oh, he nailed it. He absolutely nailed it. Because his model was correct. His model of how mankind works and what our relationship to the spirit world was correct. And so he got the correct answers from his inputs. And he wrote it about the same time. He was writing during the war years, if I'm not mistaken. It was like 1948, 47 was when he was writing his book. You see? About the same year as 1984. So.
Okay.
And two classics of science fiction that are really grim and depressing. So then go back and watch Star Trek, but not Star Trek Diversity or any of those other garbage shows. Because they're actually being written by mundanes. They're written by people who don't have imagination.
Yeah.
Because they can't permit themselves to think about what mankind is really like. Because if they did, their theories would fall apart. You can't have a socialist utopia if you know how human beings actually act under pressure, or what they act for. You know, if you don't know why a man works, if you don't know that we're trying to feed our families, that we're trying to feed our wives and kids, then you don't understand labor. You don't understand economics. You don't understand politics. If you don't know why we're ambitious, if you don't know why we're afraid of each other, if you don't know why nations are armed, you say then you can believe in world peace. But you have to understand mankind to do that. Now, one way to understand mankind is to think about the Vulcans, who don't have the same emotions we do. They're much more logical than we are. Or think about the Klingons or the Kzinti, who are much more aggressive. Or think about the Pearson's Puppeteers, who are much more cowardly, or the Polanians, who don't go into combat like we do. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Think of it in terms of an alien species, and you'll see what we're really like. See? So.
No, I agree with you. So.
So I think the Space Princess. There is one other guy who joined. His name is Ed Willett. He's a Canadian, and so far there's only the two of us in the movement. But we're going to oversweep the world. I'm confident, and just have a lot more female monarchs.
Well,
female monarchs in nearby planets who need rescuing from space goblins. So.
Well, that's fair.
The book I'm working on now is called Space Princess of the Mystic Arts. So yes.
Fair enough. Well, on that note, thank you everyone for joining us for this episode. I hope you've enjoyed it. It's a bit all over the place, but join the Space Princess revolution today.
There we go. And the monarchy will put down the revolution abruptly with their space marines butting you peasants in the face with their space guns, with the butts of their space rifles. That's the one thing that space monarchies almost never mention is that they're monarchs and they're better than you, so they're probably not going to marry. The princess probably would not marry the lovable space rogue, except for the fact that her planet was blown up, so her father is not there to stop her. So on that note, like, share, and subscribe. Like, share, and subscribe, and we'll talk to you next time. Thanks.